Insights session today. Thank you for joining us. Hope you're having a great day wherever you are in the world. Today, we are very privileged to have Amanda and Tshego join us from Mobius Consulting. They are specialists in the security space, obviously a very hot topic these days in terms of what's required out there to secure and ensure security across applications and the digital channels. Amanda is a senior managing consultant at Mobius, and Tshego is a managing consultant. Both of them have extensive experience in this space. So we are privileged to have you today. And Tshego, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you making the time available today.
Thank you.
And thanks, thanks for having us and hosting us. I'm going to just bring up my screen. So we've got the presentation to talk to. And thank you, to everyone on the call as well. Thank you for joining and taking the time. Hopefully, hopefully you're going to take some key things away. I think there's a lot. Tshego and I were saying it's always interesting with these conversations. We tend to find that we don't end up having enough time because there's a lot to discuss in this space. So just looking forward to just sharing our learnings, knowledge, insights, and hopefully if you're able to take one or two things away from this that helps you in embedding security within DevOps, then we'll be very happy.
Just for our audience today, Amanda, everybody, if you haven't joined the DVT Insights session before, just a reminder, please, that if you have any questions, we do welcome those. Raise those in the chat window. I will moderate those and have those available to the team. We will allow the team to present through the first 40 minutes or so of today's session, and then we will cover session questions in a Q&A at the end. So again, any questions that you have, please raise those in the chat window. I'll pick them up from there and pose them to our team. Amanda, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Carl. All right, so let's get into it. So really today is around security and DevOps, all about shifting security to the left. So myself and Tshego, like I said, hopefully going to just share some practical insights with you. Either, you are on this journey of embedding security and maybe you have some wins and hopefully there's some things that you might be struggling with and hopefully we're able to give you some tips on how to tackle some of those things, or maybe you're at the start of your journey and you're not really sure where to start. So I think regardless of where you are, I think there's definitely some stuff in here that you'll be able to practically take away and implement within your DevOps pipeline. So really what we want to just go through today, I'm going to do kind of just a quick DevSecOps overview, just our experience in the space, where we are coming from, what lessons we've learned over the period of time that we have been doing this, sharing those with you. And then Tshego is going to just take us through kind of a recommended approach for successful implementation in terms of embedding security and shifting security to the left, and then what that model actually looks like. And I think that's where a lot of the insights are really going to come. Okay, so just in terms of our experience, so just to give you a bit of background in terms of what we've done and kind of where a lot of the content in the pack does come from. So we've helped a number of organizations in terms of coming up with their strategies and their plans for embedding security within their DevOps lifecycle. So how are you actually going to go about this? What is fit for purpose for your organization in terms of where you are? Obviously, an organization that the knowledge around security or the importance of security, where that is very limited, you're going to apply a very different strategy and plan versus an organization where maybe the people that you have in your DevOps team have some security training, have an understanding of security. So that strategy and plan is very important, and making sure it's fit for purpose. So we've helped a lot in that space. And then in line with that, just the adoption and the embedment of security. So, it's great to have the framework for security and DevOps. It's great to have maybe the governance artifacts, the standards around it. But like with anything document related, if it just sits there, it's not going to add any value. So, we've helped organizations in terms of really adopting and embedding security into DevOps. Like I was mentioning now, we have also helped in terms of developing the governance aspects around this. So making sure, roles and responsibilities are well understood. What are those secure coding guidelines? So setting that baseline for everyone in the DevOps team around how code needs to be developed securely. And then practically how we tackle this, and that is done in the form of security playbooks. We've also just helped in terms of even selecting and doing reviews of security tools. So, from one tool to the next, there's so many tools out there. What's going to be best depending on, your DevOps environment and how you operate. And then even being part of, Scrum teams, daily stand-ups, and playing that security advisory role in those stand-ups. And through all of that, I think the space is, it's always growing, this industry that we're in. So we're constantly learning, and I think it will be great to see at the end just some questions as well. Maybe we'll learn some stuff from some of you as well. Okay, so just to take a step back, I'm sure a lot of you already know this, but I think it's very important, and this talks to, why we do this from a security perspective, and why it's sort of close to our hearts and why we're passionate about it. So obviously, there's a lot of value to be gained from DevOps, from integrating software development with your IT operations, creating efficiencies in how you get applications and products to market faster. So reducing the production time and costs through that incremental development. The continuous learning that obviously happens, so that by the end of the development process, we have something that is of high quality. So obviously DevOps enables that. And then of course, from a DevOps perspective, it really does support the software development side of things. So having DevOps in place, there's a lot of value, and of course, I think we all see the benefits in it. When it comes to SecDevOps, all we're doing is just taking it to the next level by embedding security practices into the process. And what this helps us to really do is to make sure that by the time the product or the application is deployed, we have a very resilient product. And there's a lot of obviously benefits to be gained from that. So DevOps, in terms of agility, faster time to market, and adding the security layer on that is making sure at the end of it, we really have resilient products, resilient applications. So DevOps is great. The SecDevOps and adding security into it makes it even better. So just quickly, and I think I've touched on some of these things already, some of the benefits and the opportunities. So, really bringing security in right at the beginning, doing your security testing earlier on really helps to identify threats, vulnerabilities, to make sure that we're not going to have to do any rework later down the line. We're not going to have to come back to the drawing board because, now somebody from audit or compliance or an assurance function is saying we haven't done X, Y, and Z, and now we've got to go back to, back to the drawing board. What it also helps to do, which is really nice, is to create that security baseline. So if you've really embedded it within your DevOps process, you end up creating a baseline that all development projects will go through. And that really helps to make sure the products and the applications that you're developing do comply with your security standards and the security objectives that have been set. And I mentioned obviously the iterative learning that takes place. So obviously through that and through embedding, security specialists, maybe within your daily stand-ups, within your Scrum teams, that helps to then obviously improve and grow the security skills in that space as well. And then just from a reporting perspective, and again, probably more in terms of reporting from a security perspective to your compliance teams to audit, the fact that you've embedded security and you've built in, let's say, security as code within DevOps, you're able to report on the security of what you are developing and the security of the application or the product that has been developed. So ultimately, at the end of this, really the value that you get really is, fewer audit findings, your level of compliance from a security perspective improves, and then you're also able to provide that assurance to your customers, to your stakeholders, that the product or the application that you've developed is actually secure. And I think that in itself really adds another layer of the value of the product that you develop. So it is actually a secure product. Okay, then just my last kind of talking point, and I'm going to hand over to Tshego after this. I think really just, key takeaways for me in terms of some of the things that I've learned and found important in embedding security is firstly, getting the buy-in from your stakeholders is really critical. Especially for organizations where they see security as a bottleneck or as red tape. Whoever is involved in this needs to understand the value and the importance of embedding security. So they need to understand the why behind it, why it's important. And if you don't achieve that, it is going to be very difficult to implement. Security should not be a bottleneck. Obviously, DevOps it's an agile process, and the security aspects of it need to support that agile process. It should never become the bottleneck, because that's not the intention of DevOps. That's not the intention of agile. So from a security perspective, we need to support that and make sure that when we use the word embedded, it really is embedded. It's almost automated as far as possible. And then just from a security gates perspective, or rather maybe your DevOps milestones that you have within your DevOps pipeline, again, you want to try and make sure those things are embedded and as far as possible automated. So like as security as code or policy as code. And that just, again, streamlines the process, and it becomes part of the process rather than something that we have to almost stop the whole process, stop at a point in time. Okay, now we need to do a quick assessment and then continue from there. So as far as possible, we want it to be embedded and automated. Obviously, there are things where there might still be like manual intervention that's required, things like your threat modeling, doing your penetration testing. Those are things that almost sit outside of the process, but then inform, very importantly, inform the security aspects of the process. And then lastly, just selecting the right tools and the tools that the development team see value in and support and fit in with the way that they do things. So that's why from our perspective, we've really helped in terms of making sure we are selecting the right tools, because that can also hinder the whole process, and you've got to go back to the drawing board again as well. So yeah, based on that, just in terms of where we've come from, some of the lessons learned, Tshego is now going to just take us through some practical approaches to how to actually implement this, and what does security in DevOps actually look like. So I'm going to hand over to Tshego. Thanks, Tshego.
Thanks, Amanda. So yeah, essentially what I'm going to be doing is sort of echoing what Amanda has touched on. So if it sounds like a repetition, it probably is, because that is essentially, the crux of how to actually go about ensuring that security is actually adopted and integrated into the DevOps pipeline. So as Amanda has said, I think on my side, I'm just going to highlight key sort of like practical mechanisms that we can use in order to ensure the successful implementation of security in DevOps, some of which have already been touched on, but I'll just, try to sort of reiterate where possible. So firstly, it's adoption. Security obviously needs to be adopted, firstly as a key component to the actual DevOps model. So, it's no use if, a team wants to maintain the DevOps title and not necessarily sort of weigh security as heavily as it should, and include it in the actual model to say we're recognizing security and we're fully embedding it into the process, and therefore we recognize the model as our SecDevOps or DevSecOps model, right? And obviously in doing so, this will require a cultural shift and a mindset shift, as well as a structural shift. And that means, wherever there are any formal communities or forums for the development and operations teams, wherever those existed, we obviously need to now start including security in those. And this obviously allows for ease of collaboration and integration. And it also just allows for alignment in how we then go about, implementing security within the entire pipeline. So everyone is on the same team, and, the goal is the same, and we're all working together and not necessarily imposing changes onto each other. The next item that I wanted to just touch on is governance, and I think Amanda did also just speak on that a bit. So from a security perspective, we obviously just need to ensure that security is also considered at a governance level, and this can be obviously accomplished through the development of security guiding principles across the entire DevOps pipeline, and also in the definition of secure coding principles. Amanda spoke about, the definition, the clear definition and distinction of roles and responsibilities, in the teams. And, that's something that we see, on a day-to-day basis where, and also depending on the maturity of where, the team is in terms of their DevSecOps journey, where now we see interesting questions coming up around, who's actually responsible now for, for example, remediating the vulnerabilities that come out of the coding stage, for code testing. And we're having interesting conversations around that to say, well, is it supposed to be a security team, or is it actually the coders or the developers who are meant to, remediate those? So just having a clear definition of those roles and responsibilities really helps. And also ensuring that, we sort of formalize some of these guiding principles, in the form of playbooks or what have you, depending on, your respective organization and where, all this information is actually being formalized. And I just wanted to also note that one of the key things that we've learned, and we basically just need to keep in mind when defining security guiding principles, is that we basically need to allow the respective teams to actually maintain a certain level of autonomy when it comes to choosing which tools they actually need to integrate into the pipeline in order to fulfill or meet those security requirements. So what we found that actually works best is for the security team to actually define the requirements for the tools, and then allow the respective teams to actually select the tool itself based on what will work better in their tool stack and what will fit or integrate better into their tool stack. So, for application security testing, for example, we as security practitioners, we we found that it's better not to sort of dictate the actual tool, that developers should be using, but just to, define at a bare minimum. These are the type of requirements we're looking for from a security perspective. This is what the tool should be able to do in terms of fulfilling, those security requirements. And then the developers can then decide on what tool they want to integrate and automate. Which then brings me to my next point, which is automation. And, like Amanda said, automation, yes, we might not necessarily be able to automate 100% of all the processes, but wherever possible, we do need to automate. This also allows for an ease of integration and also adherence to those security principles and just ensuring that those security gates are actually enforced, and also we all know and love automation for just simply making things easier. I mean, if something can be automated, then let's automate it, right? And then finally, the one thing that we've also found works is in actually developing a roadmap or a plan for adoption for all of the above points that we've sort of like touched on. And essentially what this means is that we just need to actually have a plan for integrating security. So, integration of security is not just going to be a once-off, okay, we bombard, the teams with security requirements and there you go, make it work. We actually need to have a roadmap, a planned approach as to how are we going to get there. Also taking into account, the maturity levels of where the respective teams are in their journeys, and also where the security team or the security capability is in terms of its maturity. Because, in some instances, you may find that security teams don't actually have all the capabilities available to provide as a service to the developers or the operations teams. So having a roadmap just allows for each of the teams to actually have a clear idea of what we need to do at what stage. And also it allows for us to, go back to Amanda spoke about, having leadership buy-in. Having a roadmap is one of the easiest ways for us to actually go back and speak to leadership in a language they can understand and show them, what the actual plan is and how it aligns with, the rest of the team and, how they can support us in actually getting to, the desired level of maturity. Okay, so those were just basically some of the practical ways that we've found to be quite helpful, in some of our client environments in terms of actually implementing or helping with the adoption of security in the DevOps pipeline. And you may have heard me now refer to those security principles or security controls, and that's basically the next portion of what I'm going to be taking you through. And that's just to actually go into a little bit of a deep dive, not too much, not too technical. I won't unpack everything there is to unpack, otherwise we'll be here the whole day. But just to highlight some of those security controls that we've identified, throughout the DevSecOps pipeline, right? And starting with at that plan phase, where we've identified threat modeling to be of great importance, and I'll also just get into each of these individual controls shortly. From a coding perspective, obviously, in terms of coding, building, and testing, we are concerned about, the security of that code. We're also concerned about the actual platforms that are being used to write that code, right? And then pre-release of the applications, we're also then concerned about actually checking if what has been found or any vulnerabilities that were identified or any threats that were identified previously have been remediated. And then also once, the application is deployed, we concern ourselves with the actual security of the infrastructure where that application is going to sit. There's no point in ensuring that, the application itself is secure, only to find that the infrastructure where it sits has loopholes or has vulnerabilities that can possibly be exploited. And then also just from an operations and monitoring perspective, we're concerned about just the ongoing monitoring of any threats and vulnerabilities that may have been picked up. Okay, so just to go into a bit of detail into each of those individual controls. From a threat modeling perspective, what we've noted is that the main purpose of threat modeling is basically just to assess an application and its surrounding environment to find as many vulnerabilities as possible before the attackers actually do. So this basically follows like a risk-based approach in identifying any threats which are of priority, and it allows for countermeasures to be implemented during both the development and operational phases in order to prevent and mitigate any of those threats. And that's why you'll basically hear how the threat modeling or the threat management aspect, sort of shows up in other areas as well, because, it's one thing to actually identify the threats in the beginning, but we also need to ensure that at an ongoing basis, we, carry on looking out for those threats and actually just mitigating and preventing them from actually being exploited. Then with regards to code, in terms of secure coding objectives, what we've noted is that vulnerabilities can actually arise from poor quality code. And if the code written by developers contains any security defects, it leaves the application open to being hacked. And in such instances, static application security testing or static analysis becomes necessary. So this is now what we call SAST, or referred to as SAST. And this is basically a testing methodology that analyzes this is basically a testing methodology that analyzes source code to find security vulnerabilities in applications. And this type of testing essentially scans an application before the code is actually compiled. And the goal of DevSecOps when automating static code testing is to essentially tighten the feedback loop to the developers by providing code security alerts as early as possible in the context and as prescriptive as possible to the developers. So SAST also examines how sensitive information such as API keys, authentication tokens, and passwords are actually handled in code and minimizes the risks of accidental disclosure. Okay, now moving on to the build phase. So with regards to continuous build, integration, and testing software composition analysis, aka what we refer to as SCA for short, and also in this same area or this phase, we also look at container security assessments. Essentially, what we look at here and what we use SCA for is in essentially managing and monitoring license compliance and security vulnerabilities in any open source components, code and software container components that are used in the development of the application. So SCA is essentially meant to aid in the prompt detection and reporting of third-party software vulnerabilities. Okay. Then at the test phase, we have application security DAST, or interactive application security testing, or IAST. So this is essentially dynamic application testing, and we use that to test applications in the staging, testing, and production environments just for assurance. So we use these tools to essentially help us identify any vulnerabilities in applications from an external perspective, as a form of a simulation of a real life outside hack, right? So the testing methods, as I mentioned before, include dynamic application security testing, interactive application security testing, as well as functional security testing of designed application security controls. Okay, then at that release phase, we have our penetration testing as a control. And essentially here, what we aim to do is identify any security weaknesses across the entire product, including the application and all of its components, right? That's like the source code, the database, the backend network. And penetration testing just also helps us to identify any issues which may leave the application vulnerable to any attacks. And this process is usually performed manually, and it thus cannot be fully automated into the DevSecOps pipeline. We do know that there are some providers who claim to have fully automatable pen testing software. But however, it's up to the respective teams to sort of evaluate, whether it actually works for them, whether, that automated pen test will be sufficient. But we found that this is one of those controls that, may need to sort of have a hybrid approach, and we can't actually fully automate it. It will require some form of manual intervention. Then at the deploy phase, what we have there is the environment security. So they were essentially just concerned about the infrastructure and ensuring that we're looking at infrastructure security. And that's obviously just to ensure that the security of the environment in which the application will exist in, just ensuring that that environment is secure. And also, what we can use there is the use of infrastructure as code tools, which will help us ensure that the application is deployed securely and without any errors in a repeatable manner. Okay, then we have at that operate phase, threat monitoring. And the main objective here is to essentially monitor for any vulnerabilities or threats in order to prevent any exploits post application deployment. So, feeding metadata from the DevSecOps pipeline into any threat intelligence capabilities that we may have will allow us to essentially enable the correct type of intelligence being gathered and applied in order to respond in an appropriate risk prioritized manner. Okay. And then finally, not finally, but at that monitoring phase, we obviously need to, conduct continuous monitoring. And obviously that's to ensure that we obtain information on how the actual application is running post-deployment, and also that any information that is collected and monitored, any information that is collected is essentially monitored to identify any issues, which can be prioritized based on the identified threats, throughout that pipeline. And this activity basically allows for constant improvements on the actual application. And finally, at a governance level, so we spoke about governance extensively, and obviously it is important, in terms of just ensuring that security is actually adopted and fully integrated. So in order to actually enable security governance and compliance across the pipeline, security principles and capabilities embedded throughout the pipeline must actually be adhered to by all parties who may be involved in the development of applications. So there's no point in, having the right controls in place and having people treat them as optional. We need to make sure that they're actually adhered to, and those security gates are treated as such. And this obviously includes everyone involved, and this includes, your third parties who they themselves should also adhere to any agreed upon secure coding principles and secure development practices that the teams work on. Right? Again, roles and responsibilities need to be clearly defined. And also, security must be checked on a continuous basis through frequent security assessments and ongoing security report reviews, which can also be automated. So this essentially brings us to the end of our presentation. I hope that was insightful. Like Amanda mentioned, we're basically just talking through, our experience as security practitioners, our experience in our client environments and what we've seen work in terms of actually, shifting security to the left. We're not developers by any means. We're not developers. I don't think we wish to be. I don't know about Amanda, but I'm not a developer. I'm a security specialist, and my concern and passion is in ensuring and helping our teams and our clients in figuring out how and where to actually embed and implement security in their development and operations pipeline. And that's all from me today. Over to you, Amanda.
Well, I think, Carl, we're going to go into some questions.
We'll do that. So just a reminder to our audience that if you do have any questions for Amanda and Tshego, just raise those in the chat window for us and we'll pick it up there. Ladies, if I may ask, so it was great. Thank you for that overview in terms of where it is. I just want to perhaps investigate just a little bit here. So for a lot of our developer folks and the folks that get involved in Scrum teams, so they're used to the idea of DevOps, of the team taking responsibility of a process that's end-to-end, from infrastructure through the application development, and then the deployment and the support in a production state. DevSecOps introduces that whole new little bubble of specialization in terms of security. What is it that will really complement a team in the way of either a participant, somebody that has a specialist knowledge to be part of that actual team that's constructed, or alternatively, what are the skills that the team needs to add to their capability in order to actually fulfill as a team in a DevSecOps environment?
So I think in my experience, what we've seen work is, how I spoke about having those forums. So having a community. So I think what I've seen work is having DevOps and DevSecOps not be an isolated sort of project on the side, because obviously it's something that touches on quite a few teams. And, what does help is developing a community or a forum where everyone really can come together and sort of cross-skill. Because, we sit in rooms where, we have hardcore developers or people in the ops side, and we can't possibly assist them in identifying any or security principles or controls that may be helpful to them if we don't necessarily know and understand what they're doing, and vice versa. They might not know where to start or what they need to be looking out for if we don't actually sit in those rooms together and actually huddle up and cross skill. And I think also with that said, we don't necessarily need to all wear all the hats. I think there's nothing wrong in outsourcing and saying, hey, security team, I actually need you guys to assist us with this. And that's where that whole roles and responsibilities thing comes into play. I think it may frustrate a lot of the developers if now we expect them to conduct all the security controls, or for them to take responsibility for actually or responsibility or accountability for maintaining all those security controls. But yeah, it definitely does help, in terms of cross-skilling and helping them understand what parts they're actually responsible for. Because like I mentioned, where in application security testing, for example, where, there's a whole list of vulnerabilities, we may not necessarily expect the developers to know exactly what to do, but we found that majority of the tools will actually tell you what the vulnerability is, what the fix is, and that's a quick, you can just have a quick read, quickly Google, check what it means, and if you need help, call out to the security team and say, hey guys, I actually need some assistance here, and they'll be happy to come in and help you.
So Google to the rescue there, Tshego.
Maybe Carl, if I can also just quickly add to that, I think we spoke about setting security or embedding your security objectives within your DevOps kind of principles. I think that is the key starting point. I think everybody needs to be on the same page that at the end of the day, we want to create something that not only adds value to the customer and functions really well and has very cool features, etc., but we want to create that in a way that it's resilient. And I think if we all on that same page as a start, it helps with what Tshego was saying in terms of the collaboration and working together, because then we're working towards the same, the same goal. I think where obviously there are trainings that you can go on. There's a lot of security training out there that you can go on. What we found is, so having that base understanding from a security perspective is great, because then when you're talking to a security professional, you understand to some extent what they're saying and what they mean. But the learning really comes in where the rubber hits the road, where you're actually working on things together. We found this issue. Okay, how are we going to solve it from a security perspective? And through doing that, that's where, and following that kind of iterative learning approach, that's where we start expanding on those security skills as well. So having that security professional, someone from the security team, form part of your stand-ups and your scrums really does make a big difference.
Okay, and I guess my question now goes towards, in your consulting, have you seen that organizations are consciously going, we need to pay attention to security, we need to be incorporating security into DevOps to get to DevSecOps? Or is it still a case that folks need the fright of something going wrong in the security space that then motivates them to start looking at this?
Tshego, you want to answer? Okay, I'll go for it. Yeah, I think, Carl, it's a good question. And I think it is, for companies that have been on this journey for some time, where they are following DevOps and they're following an agile approach, I think they're now starting to see the importance of security. I hate to say it, but there definitely is that element of it only really becomes important once, there's an incident or something happens. So it's kind of, that thing of, well, it will never happen to us, we're okay. So I think that's at least what I'm seeing, unfortunately. So it only becomes a priority once something really, really happens.
So to Tshego's point, once you're Googling what is ransomware, suddenly you have a great interest in DevSecOps.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, and I think it probably goes towards what we've seen in software development in the past, the whole thing of building quality in and moving to agile methodologies and things like Scrum, where you can see the progression, where you can see any issues, and you rectify those before the release of the application. The same goes to now considering baking security into the development process and the release process of what you're doing. And obviously, in your case, having to go through all the layers from infrastructure through code through to release process, and then obviously in production environments, the management of those environments as well. So I'm sure it's probably in a similar vein of finding traction now slowly, but would gain more if folks were probably more public about the incidents that they face.
Yeah, true.
So maybe what Mobius needs to do is just publish a bit more on the statistics side, going 75% of our customers come to us after an incident, and then hopefully we see a reduction in that percentage over time.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
All right, we do have a question from Isaac. I'm just going to read from what he's got there, and his question really goes, what would you advise about SAST application at a code stage? Should be done during pushing of the code, or is it at the merge level of code? So that's a fairly technical question, but I guess it's where do you do that sort of analysis and application to the code side of things?
So first of all, I'd also need to upskill myself to know what the difference is between at the pushing. Let me just see what exactly was said here.
Google quickly.
At the pushing of the code or at the merging of the code, I'd first need to know, what the key difference is there. But yeah, essentially,
I'll take a crack at it. So effectively, the pushing of the code winds up being when you start to do things like checking code backend. So still at a contained level, an isolated level, as opposed to merging of the code going back into the main release candidate that you're actually going to push out there. So I guess it's pre-integration with the rest of the code of an application, or once it's integrated in. And I almost am going to hazard a guess that you're going to go both. Check on your own and see whether you are secure to the degree that your units are secure, and then check again because of any of the potential integrations that code might actually adopt, or holes that it might open up in other areas of the application itself.
Yeah, 100%.
I was going to say the exact same thing in those words.
I think from a security point of view, the standard answer when people go, how often, is more, right? All right, so Isaac's happy with that. To your experience again, in terms of this, what are the things that go wrong around people actually looking at implementing DevSecOps? You mentioned bringing in a champion, having an understanding of the why, and then again, obviously the leadership from organizations such as yours in terms of the how. But beyond that, what are the practical things that really get in the way of successful DevSecOps implementation for organizations?
I think the one thing that we're seeing now is that whole definition of roles and responsibilities. Like, when that's not clear, some of the things that are implemented in there could just, remain without anyone actually going back to see, what vulnerabilities were found, for example, and who's actually responsible for remediating them. And I guess that's more at like a technical level to say what could possibly go wrong once it's actually in place. I don't know, Amanda, if you have any idea on what could go wrong in the actual implementation,
I think if you look across, each of the steps within DevOps, I think definitely I think, you know, I mentioned about the clear objectives. So I think that is definitely one thing. So if there isn't the end objective of creating a resilient product, a secure product, at the end of the day, the business wants us to get quality products out faster. So that's going to be the focus. So I think that at the starting point, the one thing is understanding why security is important, and the value that it brings. So I think if that is not understood, this whole thing does tend to fall flat. From a code perspective, Tshego mentioned, this is where a lot of vulnerabilities are introduced, is when we're developing the code. So you want to make sure you have those secure coding guidelines defined. And then obviously doing the security checks and assessments thereafter to test that the code is secure, that it has been built securely, that the application has been set up and configured securely. So, and the other important thing is the penetration testing. So that really does add a lot of value, because at the point that you do the penetration testing, you've now pulled everything together. So it really allows you to see, from a security perspective, we've done all these checks and balances up until this point, and now everything's come together. And now that everything's come together, we do this penetration test to check where if we have actually plugged all the holes, all the gaps. And I think that's also probably a part where that doesn't necessarily happen. And it doesn't need to happen for every single release. Obviously, you need to define, based on your risk appetite and the threat modeling that you've done, you need to define what would require a pen test and what type of pen test is required. So that understanding of what type of pen test and for what types of applications or deployments we need to do those pen tests, that also tends, at least I've seen that also tends to fail. So I think from a planning perspective, it's making sure that you know, the security aspect is seen as a priority. From a coding perspective, you're following those secure coding guidelines and practices. And then from a build and test perspective, you are doing those sort of iterative security tests to make sure that your code is still secure. So as you obviously building, and then as you bringing code together, making sure that you're doing that security testing, and then the penetration testing side of things. So know when and where you need to do those pen tests.
Great.
I don't
Thanks,
know if that answers the question.
It does. Thank you. We got another question from Esther. Why are you more vulnerable when third parties are involved? And if you could share any examples of success or failure in that space.
I think if you Google recent breaches, security breaches, you know, that will give you a clear understanding of why third parties are dangerous. But yeah, essentially, you know, they bring in a whole level of a risk factor on their own. And like we mentioned, even with having third-party developers, you know, it's imperative that we ensure that they also adhere to, they follow the same rules that the in-house developers, you know, are bound by, and get it at a contractual level as well. You know, we've gone as far as developing those contractual clauses to say, you know, when sort of sourcing your third-party developers, have them also, you know, sign off to say they should know what the baselines are and what's expected of them, and also that they need to essentially follow the same security standards as what the internal team, you know, follows, because otherwise they just open a whole can of worms. You'll have a brilliant security program and they are your one loophole and everything just breaks.
I guess that also goes to understanding the maturity of security implementation within your organization. So it's great to think of an organization as having best practices in play around security implementation and everything around a DevSecOps pipeline. But quite often, particularly from the consulting side, it's DVT experiences, we go into organizations and go, you aren't considering these things. So for any organization out there that is thinking about this, it's to be honest with yourself and your business to go, where are we in terms of the maturity of our implementation of security around our process and development? And if you aren't strong in that space, find a partner organization that can bring that to you so that out of a program or an engagement, not only do you get the project delivered, but you get the maturation of your processes and your security implementation from that organization as well. Any decent consulting organization should be bringing that forward. And I guess from your side, Tshego, Amanda, you see that as well in terms of organizations coming in consulting and helping lift that. How do organizations then try and make sure that that gets entrenched and that they don't fall back to bad practices? Is it one of those things that comes into the governance side of things?
Yeah, so Carl, are you referring to, if you're using a third party to assist, whether it's development or whatever it might be, once they leave, how do you ensure that continuity and things don't kind of fall back the way they used to be? So I think, from our side, a lot of the times what we try to do, and that's why we always see being part of the team is very important, and the transfer of skills is very important. Part of what we do, in the governance space is making sure that things are documented. It is very important, especially, if there's, people coming in and going out, and, just to make sure that there's something to go back to, if there isn't a sort of set team in place that you can go to and say, or that they can make sure whoever is coming in are following those practices or following those principles, outside of having the people who have the knowledge around it, having the governance around it, the policies and the principles defined, does help with the sustainability of it. The ideal kind of situation is where by the time we've done what we needed to do, we've made sure that there's also a training aspect has taken place, and there's some level of competency that's been built up in the organization. That's the ideal, and they can run and operate based on what's been set.
So Amanda, from your side as specialists in security, do you sometimes conduct sort of audits for organizations to go, this is where you are and where you need to be, and help them then roadmap how they progress and how they become more mature with respect to security?
Yes, yeah, definitely. So, but both from an assessment side. So if you just want to, do sort of a management review of where you are from a security perspective, and we're doing this more and more in the DevOps space as well. So just based on those principles across your DevOps pipeline, just assessing your maturity, using frameworks like NIST, like OWASP. Assessing that level of maturity, and then definitely from an audit perspective as well. We have a tech assurance function that if you're looking for something more independent and it's not at a management review sort of layer, and you're looking for like an independent assessment, that is definitely something that we're doing from a security perspective. Again, whether it's ISO that you might be following from a security perspective, or NIST, or whatever it might be, we do those sort of independent assessments as well.
Fantastic. All right, I see that we're right at 12, right on time in terms of our session today. There might be a couple more questions, but if there are, what we'll do is log those and get those back to you. Amanda, Tshego, thank you so much for your time today and sharing your expertise in the security space around DevSecOps with our audience today. We really appreciate you having come in and done so. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, Carl. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
And thank you to our audience for attending today. Look forward to seeing you again at our next DVT Insights session. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Bye.